Brett Holmes on the Lions passing on Jalen Carter, Tyree Wilson, and the cognitive strain that mock drafts place on the public. You gotta battle the whole thing of people having minimal information versus people having all the information, which is us. And it's tough for the fans because all they have to go off of is information that they see. The people putting together these mock drafts the last 2 to 3 months. Well, we've been grinding it for the past 9 months. Whenever you put a cognitive strain in a project, i.e. mock drafts or forecasts of where a player is going to be picked, when the desired result isn't what you wanted, your brain's not going to like it. I would simply not scout college players. This is Robbie, friend of the stream, Robbie Greer. Take all those resources and give them to the coaching staff to scout and game plan for other teams. On draft night, just go off ensemble of the mocks plus market. Ben is the person who created Grinding the Mocks, which is a crowdsourcing mock draft database. Think of it like the Metacritic of mock drafts. This is the future that scouts are scared of, that football will become more like baseball. Okay, never mind. I don't even think there are too many scouts or that they don't have value. It's just the draft is much lower ROI thing for them to spend their time, to spend their expertise on. Interested to see what you would rank higher in terms of ROI. I would also be interested. Although let's ask Robbie. All right, Robbie says he wants to come on. Yo, what's up? How was the draft for you? You know, like, do you do anything fun for the draft other than like watch it? Do you even watch it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's fun. I don't think it's the most impactful thing, so I don't put a lot of effort into it, but just fun as like a fan. So I'm a Patriots fan, so it's fun to watch from that perspective. And I used to get like super into it, but I think it's just like, how much does it really matter for betting? How much does it really matter for the team that I'm rooting for? Not that much. Just kind of like a fun thing to watch on TV.
Okay. Yeah. And I saw that tweet, and like I didn't know if it was like, I didn't know if you were trolling or not, because like like I would say like Ben takes himself very seriously when it comes to like mock draft aggregation, right? And so
Yeah.
and so it's like, not to pick on Ben, like we all love Ben, but it's like, oh, he's so easy to like get when it's like, hey, drafts suck, and he's like very reactive to that, right? But for you to say like, oh well, there's other places you could spend your time to improve a team, right? Improve like WAR over expected for a team, wins over expected for a team. I guess like in a lot of people's perspective, adding a player for like slot value in the draft, you might be getting an MVP or a MVP caliber player for the value of a rookie contract for several years. Like, I suppose, like, how do we weight the idea of like an impactful player on a team like that versus like, roster management, salary management, play management, all of that kind of stuff too. Like, I suppose like Ben's question of like the ranking of return on investment for a team, like what is higher than the draft for you?
I mean, I think probably coaching and just like roster management in year. Like, how much do we think Kyle Shanahan's worth? If we say like, hey, Jimmy's not a good quarterback, but they can go to the Super Bowl with him, or Brock Purdy as a rookie, they can go deep with him. Like, to me, if that's true, then Kyle Shanahan, just having him erases like just a ton of bad decisions you make elsewhere. Not to say that the Niners roster is bad and he, can take any roster to any distance and win a Super Bowl, but like that seems much more impactful to me. Take Andy Reid too. I mean, Andy Reid has had success every single place that he's gone. He's had success with pretty much every quarterback he's ever coached. They've all performed their best with him for the most part. So, getting coaching right seems wildly more important than getting the draft right, which I think we all understand is like very random, right? So if you want to focus your intellectual capital as an organization around maximizing your ability to perform well in the draft, which is a highly random event, how much edge are you able to reliably eke out of that effort versus like finding the next best coach? How much effort have we put into analyzing a team's ability to actually identify who's going to be a good coach and who's not.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen anyone look at that, but I imagine like that is probably a more important thing to get right, and it's part of the off season and it's covered a bit by the media, but like that should be a much bigger event in my opinion.
To your point, like coaching is so important in the NFL, similar to the NBA. Like we saw, like I'm from the Bay. My greatest example of this is Mark Jackson to Steve Kerr. Like, yeah, see, there we go. That's right. Like we're gonna get LeBron. So, but going from Mark Jackson to Steve Kerr was like a very clear, good example of like from a coach who takes you to the playoffs to a coach that takes you to a championship, right?
Right.
So there are definitely edges there where it's like, yeah, if you invest your energy into promoting the culture of education and coaching to your players, like are you getting like minute for minute, hour for hour better ROI versus the draft? Now, it is an interesting point because like the coach, whoever your head coach is, they are instilling like not just like plays and roster management, but they're also instilling like philosophy and like sleep management, travel schedule, diet, right? Like there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that most people like don't or give credit for, right? Like one of the bigger things that I have witnessed in my time with my team is like the emphasis on like healthy regimen, whether it's sleeping, whether it's diet, off-season work. Like there is such a push in philosophically of like we need to be good athletes 365 days out of the year, not good athletes during like the 200 days in the season, right? And seeing people come in like for preseasons and like they're just like clicked in and like so like ripped out of their minds already, and it's like that's impressive, but that's also like team philosophy at any level, whether it's the NBA, the MLB, the NFL. And so I think you're right to some extent that like having a leader impact like organizational decisions directly for players does have a lot of return. But how much effort should, say, scouts be putting into like coach evaluations, or like who would be doing that work if it is like in this world of like, all right, we're gonna trade the resources we put into the draft, which is a ton. They put like from the moment the off season begins, like if you're out of the postseason, you start then and you're going to the draft with draft prep and like leaderboards and big boarding. Like there's a ton of resources. You were completely right there. But who from that group of like amateur draft work people should be doing things like coach evaluation, front office evaluation, acquiring new assistant coaches or offensive staff or defensive staff or nutritionalists or specialists for your coaching staff? Like whose responsibility does it fall under, and is it like a give and take situation in terms of the draft?
Like in terms of who decides where to allocate resources within an organization and like a front office?
Yeah.
I mean, like I think for starters, it seems to be a bit of an arbitrage opportunity to spend money on your front office because it's not subject to salary cap. Mm-hmm. So like, your roster is constrained by that factor. If you piled a ton of money into data scientists and expensive talent, or even just like bigger departments that are more well-resourced, like could you get effectively free wins that are not subject to the salary cap constraints? So like just as a starting point, that would be one thing. Like maybe you don't take people off of college scouting, but you just add more people to, players in the league, scouting them, scouting other teams, doing all of that work. But I also think like, and this is maybe some bias that I have as a Patriots fan, but one of the hallmarks of that franchise is they know other teams relative to their own probably better than anyone else. They know all of the players around the league, which serves them not just in-game, which you see with like Bill Belichick out-coaching other people and winning on scheme and having a different scheme every single week, which no one else seems to be able to do for the most part. not only does it serve them well in season for winning games, but also in the off season, they know all the free agents that they want to go after, and they can compare those free agents relative to the players on their team, and they always seem to be getting extra value relative to everyone else in free agency. The downside is that I think Bill Belichick thinks he's a little bit maybe smarter than the rest of the league in the draft, and is like always reaching there. So like, I don't know. I saw a stat that they reached more than any other team this year, which like doesn't surprise me. They do that all the time. But like, do those mistakes in the draft come close to negating what they do during the year with all of the energy and prioritization they put into scouting the rest of the league? And I think that his track record would show no, it doesn't. Like it's marginal relative to that. So I think it's really like, if I'm operating in this world where my resources are constrained and I only can put a certain number of scouting people in different departments, like I just wouldn't put that many in the draft, not just because I think that they would be, there's value towards putting them towards scouting the rest of the league, but also because they're alternatives to the draft, right? Like your best scout is just not that much better than the market plus some consensus mock draft rankings. So, like even if you have someone really good internally, the marginal benefit you get from them is just not that high, which is part of why I was saying like a little bit shitposty, a little bit tongue in cheek, like, hey, I wouldn't have a scouting department for college. I would just put everyone on scouting other teams.
Yeah, and well, so I guess that's the interesting point that was made. It was like a few different points. One, great paper from Louis Paulus, friend of the stream. He wrote that paper for Saber Analytics about the advantages of the front office and how it's like, if you expand your front office and your budget, it is free wins, right? Like the more people who could cover more data is always incrementally increasing towards like 1+ win at some point in time, right? And like certain teams have done that. Certain teams have seen no like stopping, right, at growing their analytics department. So Louis Paulus, I think that was 2013 or 2014 paper. But anyway, and baseball has clearly been like very bullish on that. So yes, you could just invest more resources and keep the same amount of resources you have and increase all the resources everywhere else. So that is true. On the other side, with like draft capital and like, as you say, a misuse of draft capital, how much does that affect your season? And this is something we were talking about in this stream. Like, we see things like draft capital and draft grades and all this shit that comes out there, like the moments after the draft. And something that I've always like found, I don't know, I haven't seen the research on it, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough, but the idea that the draft is going to incrementally help you, just like acquiring new players in any realm, will help you inch closer to your championship probability, increasing that, right? I wonder what draft capital over, call it 6 years, invested correctly and championship probability increases are, right? Like it's something that I haven't seen, or even just playoff increases, right? Like this would be a pretty simple problem for well, not simple, but this is a good project for someone to work on that I haven't seen the research on, but I'm curious to know if you know anything about like using the draft analytically correctly and increasing playoff probability.
Yeah, I have not seen anything on that. I'm sure that it will be coming as more people look at this. I think like, draft analysis I've seen it like evolve a lot over the last couple of years, like even just this year, a lot of people releasing new stuff in terms of how to value trades and like putting those tools into people's hands and just educating people on what quote unquote optimal draft strategy is. So I think that that's really good. I think we'll probably see a study like that soon. But I think as we look at this, like our notion of what is the optimal draft strategy might change too, right? And it really is dependent on what your objective function is as a team. I was discussing on Twitter in like a very cursed thread on the Houston Texans decision where I was like kind of defending them and saying it was like probably not that big a deal that they made this quote unquote bad decision. But like deep down in that discussion, one of the things that I mentioned that I think like we should probably all double click into more is like, is grinding value out of every individual pick as like a portfolio manager of this like long-term investment strategy the most optimal strategy? For like aggregate win percentage, probably, right? But if your objective function is Super Bowls, then like wouldn't you want to take a higher variance, higher risk approach? And are you trying to extract the most expected value out of the draft capital that you're given, or are you trying to increase that ceiling? And so, like, is the pick that the Panthers made really dumb from like this expected value notion that we have? Like, sure. Is it also probably dumb from like an expected ceiling standpoint? Yes, probably. But like taking two big swings on like blue chip players is probably not as bad as we think from like a value destruction perspective, because the scenario in which it hits, there is like high upside, which I think is like kind of what teams should be managing the draft more like, maybe more like options or like tail event type portfolios rather than like diversified portfolios where like I accumulate a ton of capital and I don't take a lot of risks. And you know, like I just get a bunch of B plus players. And if I ever hit the A plus, then I'm winning a Super Bowl for like 5 years, right? So I think like, do we actually even know what the analytically sound way to draft is? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We're smarter than we were a year ago, 5 years ago, for sure. But like, do
Right.
we really have it figured out? I'm not even sure.
Yeah, and like you're right. Like every year, every moment, I feel like we're seeing something new. Whether it's a new version of like draft valuation, or like the difference between draft value and surplus value, and then positionally, like when to draft players. Like all of this is really interesting research. I just feel like whenever we dive too deep down one like very interesting but specialized hole, we fail to connect that back to like the ultimate objective, which in most teams' portfolio of players, you do need a maximized championship probability, because that's inherently the thing that makes the ownership the happiest, right?
Right.
Like, in order to keep your job, you need to win a lot of games. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I
so
think like, and like just on that point, the other thing that like, um, I feel like, you know, annoy is a strong word. I like at the end of the day, I really, it doesn't bother me, but like one of the things that I wish was a little bit different about how we talk about the draft, and I guess maybe football writ large, is like applying our standards or our beliefs for what is optimal as like truth, and being able to say definitively who is smart and who is dumb. And like in the draft specifically, like who the hell knows what they are optimizing for behind the scenes, or like, you know, you've worked in organizations both like in sports, in corporate America, like there are a lot of stakeholders involved in these decisions. And if you think as a GM you can just like unilaterally maximize value and everyone will be like cool with that, like that's just not how it works. You will be one, like you will never get that job if that's how you operate within an organization. You will never be given the privilege to make unilateral decisions and be a GM. But two, like you'd be fired so quickly. If the owner says like, "Hey, you need to go get this defensive end that I really like, and I own the team, I write your check," and you're saying like, "Hey, man, we need a quarterback," what would the smartest thing to do be? Go get the quarterback first, so that you can more cheaply trade up for the defensive end right after. And like on paper, that looks like the dumbest thing ever. And I'm not saying that this is what happened, but like when you look at the circumstances, like that's a brilliant move by the GM, operating with the cards that he or she was dealt, right? So I
correct.
think like it's really difficult for us to just look at this all and say like, wow, look at these idiots running these teams.
Yeah, there is something to be said about like the political nature within each organization. You know, you mentioned like my time outside of a team, and it is true. Like, you know, when instead of a coach or a GM, I'm answering to like all these franchisees, and one franchisee thinks like moving average, like rolling average mean is a better predictive model of store sales than any model that I ever make with like 20 years of receipt data, right? Like, I'm like, I could fit a linear model with like a handful of parameters and I'll beat any rolling average. And they're like, yeah, but we trust the rolling average. Like, okay, well, that's like, I'm never going to win there, right? Like, that's a person whose logic has been made up. Like, there is no science or soundness or reasoning that will deal with someone who just says, yeah, I like that thing. It's like, you know, a person who ends up taking a running back. They're like, oh, I like that person. Like, okay, well, we're gonna draft him now, right? Like, that's totally, like, it sounds insane from like an outsider perspective, especially data people, where it's like the number one thing should be objective evidence that a person is going to provide immediate NFL caliber of value on day one. Like, sure, like we everyone wants that, but you're working in like very random circumstances when you have like an owner. I'm not saying this happens, but say in the NFL draft, an owner, you know, their kid went to like a on-field day with a particular college team, and they had a good time, and they remembered that, you know, this player was nice to them. Like, that ticks them up the board simply because the owner's kid had a good interaction with them on a celebrity day. Like, these are the things that tick players up the board sometimes, you know? And it's like,
Right.
well, you can't control for that. Like, no one's mock draft is like, yeah, well, like, I saw Jed York and his family over at the Cal football pro day, and they were having a good time with the cornerbacks. They're going to draft a cornerback.
Right.
Like, no one's putting that into any model, right? But that goes into a model, and that would be like the Niners model, because they have to deal with that, right?
Right. And all the effort that you put into building that model would immediately go out the window, like as soon as that person left. Right. So just be like a continuous grind to like make these very bespoke models. But yeah, I mean, I think like the best analytics and the best analysis is the analysis that gets used. If it's just on paper, like, it doesn't matter. And I think that that's like one of the hard things to accept, maybe, is like, you know, it doesn't matter how good some of the analysis is that different people are doing online, or that different departments within organizations are doing. Like, what matters is the analytics that gets onto the field. And if you're strictly focused on like your dogma, your analytics will not get on the field, unless you're like the best storyteller or have like, you know, a special relationship with the GM or whatever. So I think it's just like, I just think it's important to like give organizations space. They're figuring this out. Like, eventually analytics is going to dominate many aspects of football. It dominates more and more every single year. I don't think it's worth it to get like worked up about having like an external lens or external microscope on like all the decisions of front offices. Like, I'm sure that they know some of the stuff that they're doing is like either smart or not smart, but they have constraints. They have organizational constraints, and like they have their own philosophies. And I think that most of them are doing the best with what they can do, with what they have available to them.
Yeah. You have any shout outs? You want to redirect, stream, chat to any of your social media?
I mean, yeah, you can check out my website or check out my Twitter. I think probably the Venn diagram of audience overlap is probably pretty strong here. So it's more just a fun convo before the Warriors game, which
That's
I think
right.
we're probably running into now.
Yeah, I think LeBron versus Steph round 1 is happening. So,
Oh
all
yeah,
right.
this is great timing. Just started. All right. It
All right, we'll take it easy, Robbie.
was a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
It's
thanks
actually
for coming on.
NFLapp.com, which is confusing as hell, but not the right domain. Anyway, all right.
See you, dude. I'm just wondering.